Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Beatrice Dupuy and I'm Director of Circle. And with me today are Meg Montee, Associate Director of Circle, and Marisol Aguirre, Outreach Coordinator for Circle. And they will be both monitoring the webinar behind the scene as we go. So for those of you who are not already familiar with Circle, we're one of 16 language resource centers funded under Title VI by the U.S. Department of Education. And Circle is housed here at the University of Arizona in the College of Humanities. Our mission is to develop and provide quality instructional materials and professional learning opportunities like the one today to language educators that are grounded in research. For more information about what we do and the resources we offer, you can visit the two links at the bottom of this slide. And here we have a map showcasing where the different language resource centers are located in the United States. So Circle is partnering with the Consortium of Middle East National Resource Centers to host a hybrid workshop on artificial intelligence and online tools in Middle East language pedagogy in April. Please scan the QR code and go to the tiny URL on this slide to register. Please note the dates for the in-person and the virtual meetings. The CFP for our upcoming ICC is available on our website, and the submission portal will open tomorrow. For more information, please scan the QR code and go to the URL on this slide to get more information. This summer, from June 2nd to 5th, Kathy Short and her colleagues will be leading a 4-day in-person institute for K-8 educators who will engage in experiences and books that invite children to immerse themselves in literature about refugee and immigrant experiences. In May, we will be hosting a webinar entitled Empowering High School and College Students to Learn and Maintain Languages for Life Through Courses on Multilingualism. Our presenter will be Peter Hecker, who led this project, which is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So the last webinar, which is part of the series which is ongoing, will be happening in March, and will focus on needs analysis. The presenter will be Ana Bocanegra-Valle from the University of Cadiz. For more information and register, please scan the QR code or go to the URL on this slide. So the series that I just mentioned, the series that we have currently is tied to language program and administration, and it is tied to a handbook published by Routledge, which will be coming out sometime this summer. And then in April, we'll get started with a new webinar series focusing on language materials. It is entitled Transforming Language Teaching Materials from Selection and Adaptation to Creation and to Successful Implementation. Please scan the QR code or go to the URL to get some more information. The webpage is still under construction, but we'll get you more information in our next webinar, and you'll get things through social media and our listserv. So today's webinar is the second of a 3-part series on language program development and administration, and will focus on language program evaluation. Our presenters are Meg Montee and Francesca Di Silvio. Both have extensive experience in language program evaluation. Dr. Montee is the director of the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center, which is just like Circle, another Title VI center funded by the Department of Education. And she's an associate research professor in the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown University. Her research areas include language testing, language program evaluation, and language teacher education. Through her work, Dr. Montee is committed to working with language educators to create and implement high-quality assessments and evaluation tools that make a positive impact on language teaching and learning. Francesca Di Silvio is a researcher focused on language assessment design and training for educational stakeholders. In 10 years of work at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and most recently as Director of World Languages, she's led a variety of test development projects, mixed methods research studies, and professional development workshops and online courses for K-12 and post-secondary educators. As an independent consultant, Ms. Di Silvio has conducted studies of world language learning outcomes, contributed to item development, review and piloting of AAPPL assessment, and developed a self-paced online foundational medical Spanish course. She currently works with the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center at Georgetown University in an advisory capacity. So my introduction is done, and you have the floor, Meg and Francesca.
All right. And it's so good to be with you today. I will be talking with Francesca Di Silvio about planning for and implementing effective world language program evaluation. And as we get started, you've already heard a little bit about the center that Francesca and I work at, the AELRC. We are one of the 16 Title VI language resource centers. And our center is directed collaboratively by Georgetown, ACTFL, and the Center for Applied Linguistics. So during today's session, we're going to be focusing on fundamental information about language program evaluation. And so we hope that as you listen, you'll gain some foundational knowledge about why we do program evaluation, what are its purposes and uses. We'll talk about some methods and examples of collecting data and how to align data collection to the questions that you want to answer about your program. And we'll discuss some considerations for analyzing and reporting the results of your evaluation. Also that we hope that you're able to consider some next steps for your own context and how you might implement program evaluation where you are. Okay. So in this first part, I'm going to start by giving an overview of what evaluation is and some of the underlying approaches that inform the work that we're presenting. And I'll pause after this section for about 5 minutes. So if you have any questions about basic principles, you'll have a chance to ask them. We'll pause again partway through, and there'll be a Q&A at the end as well. Okay, so what is language program evaluation? Well, really, just as a starting point, I want to start with kind of a very simple way of thinking about it, which is that program evaluation is a process, right? We are asking questions about our programs. We're gathering information and data that helps us understand and explain what's happening. Then we're making changes and improvements that help us ask more questions. Okay, so we really see it in this process-based approach. It's human-centered, it's inquiry-based, and we'll provide some more technical definitions. But really at a very high level, this is how we think of program evaluation as this cycle of asking and answering questions with data and evidence from our programs. Okay, and we can think about reasons or motivations for conducting program evaluation that are both internal to the program and external. And it was great to see all the different contexts that you all are calling in from today. I think whatever your context for evaluation and the reasons you may be doing it, we want to focus today on how to maximize the usefulness of this process and how to apply some basic underlying principles, whether you have internal or external evaluation happening. So what I mean by internal evaluation is this is a program evaluation that is initiated internally within the program and driven by programmatic goals or decisions, often focusing on supporting practical questions within the program. Maybe you want to look at how you could increase teacher retention or what is happening with shifts in your enrollment patterns. So these are things that you identify and decide to pursue as an evaluation internally. In other cases, you may be undergoing some kind of external mandate for evaluation. This can be required by an external group, such as a funding agency, an accreditation group, or perhaps your institutional administration, where they require you to go through evaluation. This is particularly prevalent for accreditation in post-secondary contexts and higher education, where there are requirements for the types of data that you have to collect and report regularly for those purposes. So what I want to say is we'll be talking in a very general way about evaluation that's going to be applicable across a wide variety of teaching and learning contexts. And what we really encourage is that even for programs that are undergoing externally mandated evaluation, where you have to do this because of a funder or some other group, that you can maximize the usefulness and the efficacy of that process for your own internal purposes. And we hope that the framework and the principles we give you will help you see how to align those externally mandated evaluations with some of your internal questions and purposes so that you can get useful things out of that in addition to fulfilling mandatory reporting requirements. Okay, so evaluation can be internal or external. And I think it's also helpful to think about who will conduct a language program evaluation, who's in charge of this. Typically, program evaluations are led and managed by small teams. These teams can include those within programs, often language program administrators or programmatic leaders. And they may include external evaluators who are either brought in by the program or perhaps mandated externally to come in and evaluate the program. And so just as I said, the principles we'll talk about today really apply across all of these contexts and evaluation purposes. Just briefly, I want to touch on some background to the current approaches to language program evaluation, because within the field of language education, we are drawing from a larger body of literature and thinking about program evaluation more generally. But we do have a good history of language program evaluation within our field, where principles from broader education have been brought in and applied to understand program efficacy, program outcomes, and to improve programs. In particular, we take on what is called a utilization-focused evaluation approach. This comes from Patton and Campbell-Patton in our reference list and promoted widely also through the work of John Norris. And in this utilization-focused approach, we are trying to maximize the efficacy and the usefulness of program evaluation so that decisions and evaluation processes are always aligned to user needs, right? So basically what this utilization focused approach means is that we want to put findings into practice, right? We want to make decisions, make use of the information that we're gathering. And so that user needs are always going to be really central to the types of processes that we're looking at in this approach. There are, of course, other approaches to evaluation that are used, but our work really comes from this utilization-focused approach. So now we're just going to take a quick poll about a few issues and your experiences with language program evaluation. So that is in the chat right now, and we will share the screen so we can look at those together. So we just want to know a little bit about your own experiences. So for this first question, if you could tell us, have any of you ever been a part of a language program evaluation, either as a team, maybe as an instructor in a program where this has happened? So you can see those results on the screen. Okay. So it looks like we're neck and neck. Many of you have previous experience with program evaluation, but many of you have not. Maybe you have some cynicism about the process based on your previous experiences because you've seen how maybe results don't get used or you don't think they were correct. So I think it's helpful to know if there's some foundational knowledge about this process, but also for yourself, think about what kinds of beliefs and expectations might you have about the process based on your previous experience. Okay, let's go to the next question. Okay, so let us know, please, if you are thinking about conducting a program evaluation of your own in the future. So you can say yes, maybe, or no here. Okay, it's great to see that many of you are thinking about this and maybe conducting your own program evaluations. We definitely encourage that. And, we'll come back to this again in the discussion, but this can start in very small and practical ways. And it can be very doable as a process within your programs. All right, let's go on to our third and final question of this poll. Okay, we'd like you to just rate for yourself the idea of language program evaluation. How would you rate your understanding of what this is, what it involves? Okay, so from all the way from I don't know anything about it to I'm an expert. Okay, looking in the middle on the 1 to 5 scale here. Okay, so many of you may have some kind of basic knowledge, but there's some room to know more. And I'm seeing in the chat that some people are totally new to this. And so we hope that there's something for all of you, no matter what level of experience and knowledge you're coming in with. Okay. For those of you who are more experienced with program evaluation, just one takeaway for you to think about is often leading program evaluations involves bringing other people into the process and explaining what it is to them. So maybe for you, one thing to think about is how will you explain to other people what program evaluation is in order to build buy-in and to help other people understand what this process is. Because we often see in our research, there's a lack of knowledge and understanding about language program evaluation within lots of different program contexts. We know a little bit about what program evaluation is, who does it, and it's great to see that some of you have experience or plans to do this type of thing. And so one thing I often talk to people about is that a good starting point for program evaluation, if you're new to this, is to begin thinking about the big questions that you have about your program. What are those things on your mind that you really wonder about and want to answer, or the most pressing practical issues that you're facing? These can be a starting point for building a strong program evaluation. So for example, you might want to know, are students who exit our program reaching the right level? And how do I even know what level that should be? Okay, again, this is just a really big question. Okay, we also might want to know, why don't students continue taking classes after the introductory level? So we could look at that in our program evaluation. Again, big questions are kind of a starting point. These aren't program evaluation questions. We'll get into that. They're much more narrow. But the kinds of things that we want to know about our programs and wonder about are often the starting point for design. So if you have big questions about your program or issues you're dealing with, we'd love to hear about those in the chat and just to get an understanding of what are some of the problems, challenges, and questions you're facing right now. Okay, so now I want to give you a little bit more specific definition of program evaluation. And this comes from Michael Quinn Patton, who I mentioned earlier, who is in the general field of program evaluation from a utilization-focused approach. And Patton says that program evaluation is the systematic collection of information about the activities, characteristics, and results of programs to make judgments about the program, improve or further develop program effectiveness, inform decisions about future programming, and or increase understanding. Okay, so here I just want to highlight this idea that it is systematic collection of information. And there's a wide variety of purposes that can be encompassed there, and also things that we might focus on: characteristics, results, activities. Okay. So in today's presentation, we're going to use this cycle to represent the program evaluation process. This is a very simplified version of the program evaluation process. Typically, we talk about many more steps, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I think this will help us get a high-level understanding of the major components involved in conducting your own program evaluation. So you're going to start, as I said earlier, we're going to start with people. We're going to start by understanding our stakeholders and primary intended users. We will explain what that means in a moment. Then you will determine your evaluation questions and indicators, collect and analyze evaluation data in step 3, and finally report and apply results. Okay, so the rest of the presentation will walk through these components of the process. So when we think about the program evaluation, purposes, okay, we have a cycle, but why are we doing this? How can we apply this cycle? The purposes are the reason for why the evaluation is happening. So these might tie back to some of those big questions that you have in mind. So you may have a formative evaluation, it may be summative, or it may be more process-oriented. But that cycle that we showed you will still apply. And this is also true, again, as I said earlier, about evaluations that are imposed through external requirements, right? We're encouraging you to tie your own questions and needs and purposes to those external evaluations so that you can maximize their usefulness for your program. In addition to purposes, we also want to think about uses, right? Again, we're talking about a utilization-focused approach. So we want to think not only why are we doing this, but what are we going to do with this information? What decisions are we going to make? What specific actions will take place as a result of the evaluation findings? And these are determined upfront by the users, by the stakeholders, and they should be feasible and concrete. So some examples, you may want to identify strengths and weaknesses of the program so that we can revise our curriculum. You may want to understand student needs and instructor expectations so that we can recommend changes or increase awareness and engagement among stakeholders. These are just some simple examples of uses of evaluation. So the decisions that would be made based on the outcomes. Okay. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about a rationale for why program evaluation matters. Why is it important? What can it do for your programs? Well, as I said, it can answer some of those big questions that you have. It can give you some data that will help you address underlying long-term challenges. It can support the decision-making process within your program. Okay, if you need to make a decision about something, evaluation is a way to do that. It can also help determine the effectiveness of your program practices and support improvements, sustain long-term program health, and increase community buy-in for the program. Many of our world language programs are seeing declining enrollments and potential program cuts. And so we see program evaluation as an important way of establishing the importance and efficacy of programs through data and providing you with information that is meaningful to your stakeholders so that you can advocate for your program and get buy-in from others. So it can, I think in this space where we're concerned about our world language programs, evaluation is one practical way that we can address those concerns. Okay. We do have a little bit of a focus today on the US K-12 context, although I know we have participants from many other contexts. And so I just wanted to highlight one thing we know that research says about program evaluation in the K-12 world language context. This comes from an article published in Foreign Language Annals. It's in our resource section as well, of a national survey of educators. which just tells us that actually many programs aren't doing evaluation, and many educators aren't sure what program evaluation is. So we do think there's a lot of work to do with explaining and promoting evaluation. So it's wonderful that you all are here, and hopefully you can turn into advocates for this process within your context. But I do think it's helpful to know that actually many people don't know what program evaluation is. They may not be ready to implement it without that kind of foundational knowledge. So as we wrap up this section on what evaluation is, I want to end with an example evaluation. And I'm just going to talk at a high level and point you towards this resource. But I think many times when I talk about definitions, purposes, and uses, people ask, well, can you show me an example of an evaluation? What does this really look like in practice? And so one of the few published US K-12 world language evaluations is done by Arlington, Virginia Public Schools. You can see on the QR code here to the school district website, as well as in the link that will be in the PDF of our presentation. A lot of the evaluation materials from this school district and from their world language program are available online. We love when people publish evaluations. It's not something that's frequently done, but it's so helpful to the field. And so for many years, Arlington Public Schools has conducted elementary and secondary world language program evaluation, including most recently published from 2015 to 2020. So looking at multiple academic years of data about their world language program using a utilization-focused approach. And some of the many questions that they were looking at was how effective was implementation? So across the district in the different schools, how effective was program implementation? And what were the outcomes? So they wanted to know student proficiency level outcomes for their targeted populations. And then finally, they wanted to look at how satisfied were users and clients of their programs. Okay, so some data about that. And so they used a wide variety of mixed methods, including classroom observations, teacher and school counselor focus groups, parent surveys, enrollment data, test scores. Okay, so this is a really large scale, robust evaluation done over many years and reported widely. So I think it's a great example and resource for those of you who are interested in program evaluation, particularly in the US K-12 context. Okay, so that wraps up the first part of our webinar, which is about just the basic principles and thinking of program evaluation. And I think that while we've been talking, you all have been entering Q&A through the webinar portal. And Kate, we are happy to take questions now for about 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to be asking the questions that have been posted thus far. So the first one comes from Anna, and she says, for the heritage language community-based schools, it's quite challenging to measure, evaluate program outcomes. What do you suggest about this?
Yeah, I'm wondering if some of those challenges might be looking at the scale of growth. So you might be seeing language growth at levels that aren't captured by standardized tests, or perhaps it may be a cost issue. There may not be program funding for standardized assessments as well. We do have some resources that we are going to share in a flyer through this program, including the Foreign Language Assessment Directory. And it has a wonderful tutorial about assessment in heritage programs in particular. So you can search for available assessments, and also that tutorial would help you think about how to do assessment in heritage programs. So I think that would be a resource to look at. Other practical things that you could look at would be student self-assessment or teacher-based proficiency checklists or portfolio tools that would help you to get a sense of outcomes in a systematic way that is linked to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, if that's the scale you're using. So those are some brief thoughts. Francesca, you want to add anything to that? No. Okay. Yeah. Next question.
So the next question is, how do we, Heike is asking this, how do we as a school communicate our goals of learning outcomes with the students and their parents efficiently and check if they align with their goals?
Mm. Yeah, well, to me, that's a wonderful question. How do we communicate with parents and students? To me, that would actually be something that would be wonderful to do as an evaluation project. So you could gather information from those stakeholder groups of parents and students about what kinds of communication channels they prefer, what kinds of information they want, and what their underlying values and principles are. And then from that, you could develop a communication plan that is going to really meet those needs and reflect it. So I know I'm deflecting that question a little bit, but I think that's a huge and important question that would be a really great fit for even a small evaluation project. So you could spend 3 months looking at that in a systematic way and gathering some data. Okay.
So someone has that's an interesting question that Noriko asked. She says AI is popular these days, but is this system, so I think she's thinking about using potentially AI for program evaluation. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so program evaluation and research methods share a lot of overlap, and you're going to see this when we talk about data collection methods. So things like surveys, focus groups, and interviews. And so there is some emerging work in the use of AI for analyzing data that I think is coming in the research field, but that would also be applicable in program evaluation analysis. I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking of, Noriko, but that would be one application. So can you use AI to help synthesize interview results or synthesize themes from open-ended survey results? Because analysis takes a lot of time and some expertise. So I would just caveat and caution people to use that with training and thought and care because it affects the validation of your results. So, all the things you would consider when using AI for research analysis would apply in program evaluation. Okay,
I
I
have a
think,
couple more. We can
yeah.
take maybe a couple more questions. One I think is pretty straightforward. Maybe the other needs a little bit more development, and then I'll come back to the rest afterwards. So Gisem is asking about the survey or the program evaluation, language program evaluation that you shared about that Arlington school district conducted. But that person, Gisem, is saying this is a longer term, large scale evaluation. Are you going to have examples of smaller, more manageable evaluations for us who are beginners in that area?
Yes, absolutely. We'll even show a part of that evaluation that's very small scale, one focus group that I think will show what could be more manageable. So yes, we will share other examples.
And this will be the last question. There are others in the pipeline, but I will come back to those later. Dawn is asking, what test scores are considered as a source of data? Are we talking about using a standardized test? And if so, what is the test used? And when is it used? At the end of the course? When? And so she's wondering, are we using an ACTFL standardized test? Are we using, for example, the National Spanish Exam? What are we talking about when we talk about using test as a data for data points?
Yes, this is a great question. And one thing we see in the research article that I mentioned from FLA is that a lot of people conflate assessment and evaluation, and they're not sure what the difference between those things are. But here in this question, I think the framing is exactly right. Assessment information can be a source of evidence or an indicator within a program evaluation. So the outcomes of those assessments can be used to answer your evaluation questions. So really, what that assessment is and how it's used would have to be determined upfront in the design process. One thing that may be helpful to think about is that sometimes you can utilize and analyze existing assessment data that you have. Maybe you already give an exam to your students, either a proficiency exam or even a course exam, and you could look at that more systematically in your evaluation. Or you may want to administer a proficiency test specifically for your program evaluation. So people do both of those things and they can be appropriate, but the why and the how would have to be determined within the design of your specific questions.
Great. Do you want to continue with questions, or are you ready to move on to the next section of your presentation?
We'll move on, and we have another break for questions
Okay,
after.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right. So I'm going to hand things off to Francesca for the next part of our talk.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Washington, D.C., and thanks for your participation so far. So in this section, I'm going to talk about the first two phases of the program evaluation process, which are really all about planning. And even within these phases, there are multiple steps and key definitions that we'll discuss. And then, as Meg said, at the end of this section, we'll have another break for Q&A, so you can continue sharing your questions, especially if they relate to this section, and we can try to address them there. So going back to our, no, go back one, Meg. Going back to our diagram of the cycle, the very first step in a new program evaluation is going to be to identify your stakeholders and your primary intended users. This is critical to start with because you're going to keep these groups in mind and involve them throughout all the subsequent steps, because that helps ensure that your results are trustworthy to these groups, to stakeholders and users, and maximally useful. And as we'll see, different program evaluations will have different purposes, stakeholders, and primary intended users. Next slide, please. So specific to your language program evaluation context, we're defining stakeholders as individuals or groups who have an interest in the evaluation and/or those who will be affected either directly or indirectly by its findings. So this is a large set of people. We list some of them here. They may certainly include students, instructors, and administrators within your program. May include parents, community members, and community leaders. That's especially in the case of those community-based language schools. You may also consider instructors and administrators in other related programs, funders, government agencies, and even more. So it's important to do a thorough analysis and thinking through of your potential stakeholders at the start of your evaluation, because that way you can ensure that their varied interests and perspectives are understood and you can prioritize them accordingly in your planning. And then by contrast, primary intended users, this is a smaller subgroup within your stakeholders. So you should think of users as the specific people, smaller number of people who will need to take actions and make decisions on the basis of your evaluation results. So these are typically people who are in management or leadership positions, and they are accountable for your program functioning and performance. Often they're going to include language program administrators, and ideally you identify users who are representing and reflecting the diversity of your program. So while stakeholders represent anyone, it's a really broad array of people who have an interest in the evaluation. Users are those who will be responsible for and have the power to use the evaluation results to make changes. And for maximally meaningful and useful evaluation, your primary intended users are people who will participate in evaluation planning activities and contribute to ongoing decision making all the way through. You'll also consider the needs and perspectives of your stakeholders, but to a less directly involved extent. And so next, we're going to do a quick poll. So I think we'll pull it up on the screen in a minute. We're going to ask you two different questions here. Based on those definitions I shared and your previous experience with program evaluation, we want you to think about your own context. So either an evaluation you did, one you plan, or just a potential one in the future. Think about who are your potential stakeholders and who are your primary intended users. These may include people that we mentioned and people that we didn't mention. So if you could go ahead, Marisol, and pull up the Mentimeter, this is, again, you're going to go to that URL or scan the code. And then these questions are in the form of word cloud. So you can type as many answers as you have. There are multiple stakeholders, and then we'll see kind of the popularity of different ones. So first, think of stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders for an evaluation? And especially if you can think of one that I didn't mention. Okay, great. So we're seeing the responses come in. Students is a big one, and that's so important. Glad you recognize that. But also a lot of administrators. I see pre-service teachers. That's one we hadn't mentioned before. That's great. The institution at large. Parents, members of the community. Deans, TAs, the state. So you can see there are some that are shared and there are some that are going to be really specific to your context and maybe really important. We also have seen evaluations that were maybe focused more on technology. So you consider the people who work in the tech department, you know, some people that might not apply in other evaluation projects. State legislatures, great. Okay, so let's move to the next one. Think about primary intended users. So same thing, you can type as many responses as you have, but again, this is the smaller group. These are people who are highly invested and have the ability to take action on the basis of your evaluation. These are going to be at the forefront of your evaluation planning. Yeah, so administrators, teachers, and the department head, in the cases where you have those. Great, these are really good responses, and it's helpful to think through. Also, I think some of the resources will talk about their stakeholders and users, which is really helpful if you're planning a new program evaluation. And as I said, if you have questions about any of these definitions or anything we're talking about in this specific section, please do put them in the Q&A. Okay, so as I hope I've emphasized, it's not just the users, the stakeholders, we want to involve them throughout the evaluation. So these are some ways that you can do that. You can include stakeholders, but if it's a large variety, maybe just representatives of each group in your initial discussions as you're launching a program evaluation, because those different perspectives can help you plan, help determine or prioritize your evaluation uses, which Meg mentioned and we'll talk a little bit more about. Stakeholders can also provide input on your evaluation questions. They may be contributing to data collection and interpretation. And you definitely want to keep them in mind and have them participate in planning for the use of results. The reasons, of course, here, again, are to maximize utility, because if you have active stakeholder engagement throughout the process, early on in the process and continual, they will feel more ownership. And that way that, of course, they can anticipate that evaluation findings will be useful. They'll shed light on things that they care about, and therefore that increases your evaluation usefulness. Next, please. So the second major phase that I'm going to talk about is determining your evaluation questions and indicators. And as Meg mentioned, this is kind of a simplified design. So this actually starts with talking more in detail as we previewed about your evaluation purposes and uses. And this is similar to the process of backward design, which most of you will be familiar with, because you're going to start with specifying what the evaluation will achieve, so that you have a project with clear goals, and then you're designing a roadmap towards those goals. Next, please. I think, did you go one ahead? I'm not sure. Okay, great. Okay, so your primary intended users, once you've identified those and started communicating with them, you really want to work with them. I'm sorry. It is your primary evaluation users who drive the evaluation purposes. So a key step after you identify them is to start talking with them about their evaluation needs. So evaluation purposes answer why users want to do or need to conduct an evaluation. So you can ask these questions during initial discussions with these users. Some of these questions that we show on the screen: what are the reasons for conducting the evaluation? What immediate concerns do we have about the program? And then also, what long-term concerns do we have about the program? What do we want or hope to achieve with the evaluation? So these are questions you can ask during initial discussions. And remember that especially with a longer-term evaluation, the process is going to be iterative and it might require some debate and revisiting. And then, as we discussed, evaluation uses are the concrete actions or decisions that the users will take once your evaluation results are compiled and reported. So again, here we wanted to share some ways to prompt users to think this through and really articulate uses. They're going to be asked to fill in the question, we need to do this evaluation in order to blank. So maybe you're identifying strengths and weaknesses, finding out how well something works, you intend to make changes, better understand, etc. So again, remember that after discussion and prioritizing, it's important for evaluation uses that you answer here, they must be feasible. So you might have multiple uses and different uses dedicated to the needs of different user groups. For example, you might have an evaluation use to find out how well the program is preparing graduates to function in university undergraduate courses. Or you might want to make changes to course placement procedures to better serve students. Those are some example uses that hopefully are feasible, and then we'll talk about how to get there. Next, please. Okay, so we want to focus on two key terms here for planning: program evaluation questions and program evaluation indicators. So once you, along with users, have established the purposes and uses of the evaluation, the next job of you as an evaluator is to develop your evaluation questions. And evaluation questions clearly state the focus of the evaluation, and they're going to help determine what data will be collected and how the data will be analyzed and interpreted. So they're really important to make sure that there's a rational, clear, and laid out in advance process for the following steps of data collection, interpretation, and reporting. So next we'll talk about some sample evaluation questions. These are just examples here. There are many others. How satisfied are parents with the program? To what extent is the program improving students' language skills? And how well are new teacher orientation practices helping new teachers prepare for their duties and role? As with evaluation uses, it's possible and many times appropriate for some evaluation projects to have more than one evaluation question. You can have multiple. But of course, you need to carefully consider the feasibility of collecting evidence to answer all of those questions. So those are practical questions of the resources and time and budget you have available. And it's important with evaluation questions, there are some key features that make them effective. So in addition to being practical and feasible, you want to develop evaluation questions that address things that your stakeholders actually care about. So that's why you want to think about all of your stakeholders as well. You want to make sure that your questions are unique. And by that, we mean that there's not already an immediate known answer or another way that you're getting this answer. It needs to be something apart from that. You want to make sure that your evaluation questions are written clearly and understandably, again, for all of the stakeholders, and that they're researchable or answerable in that the information is available to be gathered to answer the question, although it has not been gathered yet. And this is really important, I think, to say in many contexts, that you want to make sure that your evaluation questions are framed in a way that is not threatening. So you're not going to alienate stakeholders or make them think that this is a punitive process or that they're being attacked. Okay, and program evaluation indicators, as opposed to questions. An indicator is a type of information or evidence that is needed to answer an evaluation question. And a given question can include many possible indicators. So a useful way to think about and identify indicators is that you're asking the question, how will we know? So for example, how will we know how satisfied parents are with the program? Remember that indicators are different sources of evidence that will be measured, captured, or described in order to examine how the program is performing or functioning. They're not equivalent to data collection methods. Data collection methods are what capture the indicators, but by identifying the indicators, they'll help you select the methods strategically. We'll talk about methods in the next section, but let's take a look at some example evaluation questions and indicators that'll hopefully make this a little more concrete. So this is a table, and it shows evaluation questions on the left paired with example indicators. And you can see that there's multiple indicators for each of the questions. So those indicators, you could select among them, or you could combine them to kind of triangulate your data. So for the first example, if you're examining to what extent are exiting students meeting the program's language proficiency targets, you might look at all of these things: proficiency test scores, student portfolio data, and student self-assessment results. If you're looking at student preparation to use the language in professional context, some example indicators might be job placement data that you can gather, as well as students' perceptions of their preparedness. If you have a question, what factors are contributing to instructor turnover? Useful indicators are instructor turnover rates, and then instructor concerns if they express directly. And then last example, we wanted to think about, many programs have this question, especially some of those community-based programs and newer programs. Do people who would benefit from the program know about it? So there you might be looking at social media engagement, things like hits, clicks, event attendance, and newsletter signups. And then, of course, enrollment data. What are your targets? Who's actually enrolling, and what is the growth? Well, we're ready for Q&A. We can read out some questions that have been received, although I know that there's a lot of them, so we can see how many we want to answer here, especially if there are questions about, I would say, uses, purposes, or stakeholders and questions. I'm happy to field those here, and then, of course, we'll save them for the end. And
Okay.
I also want to note that a resource we have in our handout, and you'll see it in the resources uploaded to the website. It's a handbook called A Guide to Useful Evaluation of Language Programs. It's a short text that has really great detail on all of these definitions. It has best practices, and it gives various examples for the different steps in planning for your evaluation, especially for the person who was asking, what's something smaller scale? There's some really good examples there.
So someone is asking, Lorraine is asking, how long should a language program evaluation typically be? And if it's done internally, how are evaluators' workloads typically accounted for, since they might hold other positions as well?
That's a good question, and I'll let Meg weigh in too. It's going to vary a huge amount, and a huge issue is practicality. So one of the things you mentioned is, people having multiple roles. How much time do they have? That might mean that you actually have a longer evaluation because you want to give them more time, or it might mean that you kind of streamline your evaluation where you're going to have a really focused evaluation question, maybe fewer indicators, so that you can keep it within the scope that really is allowable. But in terms of how long it might take, I'll let Meg answer, but I think you could do something more quickly in a matter of months, but also these could be over a year or longer.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a huge range of scope and timeline. Again, we would go back to the principle as what of utilization. So in order to make the outcome of the evaluation as useful as possible for the decisions you need to make, what would the timeline be? And so that's something you think about up front when you consider those decisions, the stakeholders that you have, and the capacity that you're able to use. And you would answer that question from that utilization focused approach as well.
Yes, I think one question related to a point that you made, Francesca, in terms of kind of data, types of data that could be collected. One thing was student portfolios, for example. And someone is asking, GISM is asking, I'm curious to know how one might go about analyzing student portfolios for a program evaluation.
Yeah, well, I think a key question there is, hopefully, I think these are something that are already being developed. You're not newly introducing student portfolios just for the purpose of evaluation, but you're taking the time to look at the portfolios in line with your evaluation question and uses. So I think that would drive your analysis. The portfolios are already being collected, perhaps graded, used by students, but how can they answer your specific questions? So if you have questions about how students are persisting in the program, or how students are feeling about the program, maybe that data is there. Maybe in addition, as assessment experts, we talk about how portfolios can capture certain things that standardized tests cannot. So maybe you're looking at certain skills that are more represented in the portfolio. But it really comes down to what are your purposes and what are your evaluation questions in that case. But I think that portfolios, if you're talking about, for example, student outcomes, they'd probably always be used in conjunction with other sources of evidence. Meg, anything to add on that?
Let me see. Well, you can tell me if you don't want to. Maybe Meg can jump in. Someone is saying, how do you address a language, because you were talking about stakeholders and finding, identifying them. So how do you address a language program administrator who maintains the status quo, particularly when language evaluation would be essential for growth?
Yeah, I saw this question earlier. It's such a big question, and I will defer to Meg on it. But I think there's a couple different things to unpack here. So, you may already be familiar. You have a good sense that this language program administrator feels this way, will be this way. But are they initiating an evaluation and not feeling the buy-in, or are they opposed to having an evaluation at all? Those are two different questions. But I think in general, we would say that if people are involved throughout, if they're part of the planning, if they're directing the activities, they might have more of a stake in it. And if you're showing that the results are going to be useful to them. So again, a really recalcitrant person, that might be an issue. But all of the steps that we talked about, and and we'll also talk about communication with these stakeholders, is going to be really important to increase their engagement, their belief that it could be effective, and then assuming it is effective, that it will actually be implemented. But yeah, that is a huge question, and maybe it'll depend on different cases. But I would say if it's someone who you think would be reluctant, and you can even bring in the idea and have a program evaluation, that could illuminate a lot of things and maybe change their mind.
Mm-hmm. So here we've talked about language program evaluation that are generated from inside and led by people who are part of the program. But someone is asking, how common is it for language programs to request external evaluations? And usually, how much would the cost be? If the institution doesn't have the budget to request external evaluation, how steep would the learning curve be to train colleagues on top of their existing busy schedule?
Yeah, a couple things there. So it could be an external evaluation. We were using it in the sense of it actually was kind of mandated, required by some sort of funding requirement or state purpose. But there is such a thing as bringing in an external evaluator, because that can help supplement your colleagues' expertise. So I think that's what the question is getting at.
Yeah, I think so
Meg,
too.
do you have any thoughts on that? It's definitely possible, and as you mentioned, it costs money, so you're going to have to weigh those kind of practical concerns. But I do think that hopefully what we're presenting here and some of the materials we're sharing is that we hope that people could be educated to do some of the work internally. You don't require an external evaluator, although it can be helpful. But Meg, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the range of costs for external expertise can be huge, from a few $1,000s to large scale tens of thousands of dollars for, total external evaluations. So I would say if you're interested, you could find some targeted support that may be financially doable for you. Maybe it's an issue of you need help with the data analysis, right? Some statistical analysis or those kinds of things, or just an advisory capacity. So there are ways to get, I think, targeted expertise that could kind of boost your internal team and may help bridge some of those gaps. And my other piece of advice would be just, we talk about building evaluation mindsets within programs and building capacity. So just starting really small with something that's very doable, that can get your team used to the thinking and process, and then you build up from there, I think can be a really good approach.
I think we're done. There's a couple more questions, but we'll see to leave this for the end.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I'll just also add, the LRCs are funded by the Department of Ed to provide free resources to U.S. World Language programs. So we're also a great source of support and resources. I love to hear from programs that are doing evaluations, and we answer questions. So you can get some support from us. So I'll end with that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to close out our next section, and then we'll have a final set of Q&A. So, as Francesca said, we know that there's a lot of terminology here: purpose, uses, evaluation questions, stakeholders, primary intended users. And so, if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all these terms and steps, we do encourage you to go to the resources that we have recommended. But what I want to say is that what I hope is becoming clear is that at a high level, language program evaluation is process-based and people-based, right? That you're working with your stakeholders and your users. You're figuring out not only what's feasible, but really how do you maximize the usefulness of what you want to do. And then you're looking at things in a systematic way within your program. Okay, it is in some ways very similar to research. As Francesca said, the scope of evaluation is just within a single program and not intended to be generalizable knowledge. Okay, so now that we have an idea of a process where we define what kinds of questions we're specifically asking, right, and what kinds of indicators and evidence we can gather, in this section, I'm going to talk about how do we collect and analyze data. So what are the common methodologies that we might use? And what are some considerations at a very high level for reporting information? Okay, so that's this second part, steps 3 and 4 in our simplified evaluation process here. Okay, so let's think about what one of the evaluation questions and indicators that Francesca gave us, which is what are the factors contributing to instructor turnover? Okay, and so if we want to look at, in particular, instructor concerns, so what are our instructors in our program identify as their concerns about their position, their workload, different things? How could we collect information on this? What kinds of tools could we use? And so in this section, we'll be talking about sources of evaluation data. Okay, there's different ways we could get at those concerns and collect that information in systematic ways. So what you see on the screen here are some common sources of evaluation data. Okay, questionnaires or surveys, focus groups, interviews, assessments and tests, observations, and document analysis. These are some of the most frequent ways that we get systematic data and evidence related to our indicators. So going back to that idea of instructor concerns that we had on the previous slide, right? I could get at those, through questionnaires, right? I could survey my instructors. I could conduct focus groups with them, or perhaps I could use interviews to figure out what they think. And each of those methods of data collection has some pros and cons to it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to just another example from Arlington Public Schools. So this is narrowing down on a part of their evaluation that I hope would give you an idea of something you could do that's a little bit smaller scale. So in their evaluation, they wanted to use focus groups. And so they investigated through the use of focus groups, the school counselors in their district and their perspective and guidance that they provide students about world language classes. And so they did one focus group with 7 middle school and high school counselors. It was a 90-minute session. And they talked to them about how language learning factors into course selection, their own counselors' perceptions of their influence on students' language learning choices, and their suggestions for world language programs. Okay, this is an example of focus group data as part of a language program evaluation. I think a really nice example of something that's useful for getting at the perspectives of a group of people. Okay, so as you may be thinking about, these data collection methods have things that they offer and some constraints. And so what you see on the screen, we often, the most frequently used data collection methods we talk about are questionnaires, focus groups, and interviews. And so what you see here is a table that compares some of the fundamental characteristics of those methodologies. So questionnaires or surveys allow for very quick and efficient data collection and analysis. You can email a link, you can see the results pretty quickly. Focus groups and interviews are more intensive. They take more time to collect and to analyze, so they don't offer that efficiency. All of the methods can be useful for gathering quotations from your participants and from your stakeholders. Questionnaires are the only method that allows for anonymity, right, which can be really important. If you have a sensitive topic or something that you may think could be face-threatening to the population you're looking at, then you may want to think about, does this need to be anonymous? Only focus groups and interviews allow for you to probe and clarify responses, right? Surveys, you're just getting what you asked. You can't follow up within the instrument on those. So questionnaires and interviews can be used for post hoc follow-up, maybe from a training or some other event, right? They can be used post hoc. Response rate impacts results and generalizability. Next, that is a consideration for questionnaires, right? So you really have to think about who responded, what percentage of people are represented in that data. Survey questionnaires also provide quantitative numerical data, whereas focus groups and interviews do not, and can be generalized to populations. So just again, some characteristics to think about. A few more here on the screen. Questionnaires are easy to obtain information from remote respondents, whereas focus groups and interviews are interactive and co-constructed knowledge, and they're very in-depth and very rich. Okay. So these are available in the PowerPoint, but when you think about your questions and your indicators, you'll want to carefully select the methods that you will use to get that data based on what's going to be appropriate for your context, feasible for you to do, and is the best match for the issues that you're looking at, right? The scope, those kinds of things. And so each of these methods has just different characteristics and pros and cons. Okay, so I want to talk finally about some issues of analyzing and reporting results. So you write your questions, you select some data collection methods, and you gather information from your program and about your program. Okay, and then what do you do next? How do you analyze this information and communicate it out to your users? This is often the final step of an evaluation, is the analysis and reporting. Well, you're going to focus on your evaluation questions. It's easy to expand the scope as you're doing things, but you want to really focus on what you said you wanted to know and on answering those evaluation questions while minimizing any threats to data accuracy or trustworthiness. So ensuring that your data is analyzed in a way that's systematic and appropriate and is going to be trusted by those who are going to see it and see the interpretation. We recommend that you use familiar, accessible, and practical tools for analysis. So part of your methodology decisions should be based on the capacity that you have within your program or that you can get support for, and not outside of that. We recommend strongly that you collaborate with your primary intended users on interpretation. Interpretation often takes a lot of time, understanding what data means in context, and you should have multiple voices weighing in on that, particularly the people who are going to use those results. From the beginning and throughout the process, you'll also want to plan carefully on how you're going to disseminate your results to different groups in meaningful ways. So this may be through reports, memos, presentations, websites, and communicating these in ways that really communicate out respect to the people that are seeing those results, and allow for them to provide feedback and input, right, as sort of a process-based approach. We hear many stories about evaluations that once complete are not trusted by people and are viewed with suspicion. And so careful planning of your reporting processes can help mitigate some of the risks there. The goal ultimately is to make decisions and improvements and support ongoing useful evaluation. So you're thinking about how can you report results in ways that are going to help that happen. So one of my favorite examples of an evaluation comes from the University of Arizona. We were really glad to highlight this as we're talking with Circle today. This comes from Language Program Vitality in the United States. It's an evaluation of the Portuguese program done by Summer Farias and Carvalho at University of Arizona. And so they looked at using a utilization-focused approach. They wanted to evaluate their program under the declining national enrollments in Portuguese classes. So they're very concerned about overall decline, and they wanted to see how their program could connect with students and their interests. And so they did institutional enrollment analytics and 4 rounds of student satisfaction questionnaires. And what I want to highlight from this example is the results of their evaluation and some of the program changes that came out of that, because hopefully this can highlight some of the ways that program evaluation can be really practical and useful. They found that their program composition included Spanish heritage speakers, and that was more than half of the program. So they found that their program health actually didn't rely on Spanish majors, which was really useful for them to understand the underlying composition of their classes. They also found, in terms of pedagogical applications, that instruction became more focused on students' linguistic profiles and career interests as a result of the evaluation, in addition to literacy-oriented activities. Okay, or they added additional literacy-oriented activities. They updated their recruitment strategies, creating online and hybrid courses to accommodate scheduling difficulties, and they expanded Portuguese for specific purpose offerings. And finally, one result of this was departmental accountability, where they really saw that keeping track of student satisfaction in a regular and systematic way is crucial to maintaining enrollments, especially for less commonly taught languages. Okay, so through this example, we see that student satisfaction surveys in this evaluation just became a really rich source of deeper understanding into program issues, so that they could make meaningful changes and improvements and address enrollment in their program and ensure sustained program health, which is what we really want to see and promote through program evaluation. So this is a wonderful example in this book if you're looking for something to look at for the US higher ed context. Okay, so I want to end with just a few final conclusions and recommendations. It's okay to start small. We've said this a few times, but you can start with one simple question, one simple focus group, and that can be your starting evaluation. Because evaluation is an iterative and cyclical process. And we strongly encourage you along the way to be people-centered, keeping your stakeholders and users at the heart of each step, so that you're maximizing the utilization of your evaluation. We encourage you to commit to transparency and follow through, using excellent communication practices throughout the whole process, to help ensure trustworthiness. To develop this evaluation mindset within your program so that your stakeholders, your instructors really see evidence-based processes of asking and answering questions as the way things are done in your program, right? And this is just part of our normal practices. And finally, if you do an evaluation, we hope that you'll publish and share the results where you can, because it's such a huge help to other programs to see models and examples of these evaluations. This is something that's pretty rarely done, but that we strongly encourage. Okay. So with that, I want to end also by saying some ways you can learn more. We have, I think it's been linked in the chat many times, but there's materials from today's talk, including the PowerPoint, a handout with information on different methods that we hope will be helpful. Our website has lots of other free resources about program evaluation, including training materials and guides that are totally free that you can use. And we also have a book published from our center. I think it's about $20. That is an edited volume by Davis and McKay, a guide to useful program evaluations. So it walks you through each step with examples and is a very practical tool for programs. Okay, so we hope those resources are helpful. And as a close, we are happy to field some additional questions.
We have one, which is a very practical question in relation to some of the tools that you've mentioned to collect data, and it has questionnaires and surveys. And someone is asking about the most effective or the best tool to create an online questionnaire. In your experience, what are people, which tool are people going to when they want to put out a questionnaire?
Yeah, I like SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics. I think it depends on what you have institutionally available. I think those do have some a learning curve on the technical capabilities of them. So Google Forms can be a great, simple, free way to collect data. Just whatever you're using, you want to make sure you think about maintaining anonymity of your respondents, if that's a consideration, and protecting the data and the information that you collect through those.
We have another question related to tools to help you when you carry out a program evaluation. So Lorraine is asking if there are any tools or software you would recommend to organize the evaluation effort. So I think it's more about organizing the different pieces and allowing you to see maybe trends that are emerging or things like that.
Yeah, I think again, thinking about like tools like a shared Google Drive I think can be great because they allow for coordination. They're typically free to use and supported institutionally, but you can also ensure some security, right? Only people who are invited have access, which is really important to think about protecting your subjects' information and privacy. So I think something like a shared Google Drive. You may also want to think as you assemble a team, if you want to assign someone in sort of a project management role who is willing to and has the skills to take that on, right? So they're the one who can create a shared timeline, for example, can track progress and ensure that you're sort of hitting milestone dates for the group. I think a lot of times that should be a named role within a program evaluation team.
Yeah, so we have one last question, and I'm not quite sure what this is referring to. Someone is asking about what about using a dynamic approach to language program evaluation? Not quite sure what this is. Becky, if you're still with us, could you elaborate on this, please?
Well, what I'm kind of wondering, while I see if there's anything coming in on this question, but what I kind of think it means is that it is maybe doing it in an iterative way where you are building and evolving as you go along. Which I think could be very appropriate in many contexts. So if you're doing something that's more formative and you really need to maybe get some initial information to get started in a larger way. I think that sort of dynamic iterative approach, if I'm understanding this correctly, could be really helpful, right? And you're monitoring things as you go along, adjusting. I think that would involve a pretty active and committed team. So I think capacity there would be kind of my consideration for people who are thinking about that sort of approach.
Great. We have two more questions. So one is coming from Melvin. Melvin, sorry, says, thank you guys for your salient insights. I'm just wondering what are the follow-up steps after completing the program evaluation? Is it essential to include an improvement plan in conjunction with the evaluation findings?
Yeah, so that's something that you would determine on the front end, the answer to that question with your primary intended users. And so you would think about why are we doing this evaluation? How are we using the information? And then what is the way that we're going to be able to implement these decisions? It could be through some kind of official improvement plan if that's useful and meaningful in your context. There could be other mechanisms through which you want to implement change. So I would say my answer is often, well, it's contextual, and that's the answer here as well. But I think your question is getting at like, yes, you do need to think about how you are going to implement things, and that is part of the reporting process. But it is something you want to think about at the front end and plan for that from the very beginning.
Great. All right. So Melissa, who says, thanks for a fantastic talk, is asking the following question. Our university's language department offers instruction in 12 languages. which all of our teaching professors focusing on language. So I guess the teaching professors teach in these in the language courses, while the more senior faculty primarily teach literature. Given that upper level courses are almost exclusively literature based, what strategies would you recommend for encouraging broader faculty buy-in for curriculum evaluation and innovation? How can we balance program evaluation in a way that acknowledges both language and literature, especially when literature courses are deeply tied to the major?
Such a great question. I mean, I think even some of that language that you just said and using that as the starting point of communication would be a great way to go. We do have on our website a workbook that is focused on stakeholder engagement at every step. I can maybe if Francesca doesn't mind, if you know where that is, Francesca, dropping that in the chat. But this is allowing you a process of thinking through at every phase of the evaluation, what does it look like to involve your stakeholders and their different perspectives and some of the tensions that can arise within those perspectives so that they're represented. Because it's not just something that's done on the front end and then at the end, but it really does sort of weave through the whole evaluation process. So we'll share that resource with you, and it might be a way for you to think through in your particular context, okay, when I'm doing data collection, analysis, etc., what does it look like to involve the perspective of the literature professors in a way that's explicit and clear and respectful?
Right. So we have no other questions, and we're almost at the bottom of the hour. Maybe I have one question. You mentioned in your talk about some of the frustrations that people experience in your in doing program evaluation. Um, could you kind of talk through about maybe the top three, and usually what kind of suggestions do you have for people who are engaging in this kind of work?
Sure. One thing I hear a lot is when I talk to teachers, they feel that the program evaluation is sort of hostile to their practices, that they're being targeted by this, and that they really are skeptical of the entire process to begin with. And so that's something I really pay mind to, is making sure that the role of instructors and teachers feels very integrated into the whole process, and that they feel that they trust it and that they respect it. I know that can be a tall order in many programs, but that's one of the main challenges I see. And it really just kind of like from the very beginning, if you have that problem, it's going to cause you a lot of issues with change and implementation at the end. Another issue I see is, as someone who sometimes works with people as in an external capacity, is like someone will say, I want to bring you in to show this person that we should do things this way through an evaluation, which of course I wouldn't do. That's not good evaluation. I totally understand the impulse there, right? You're like, if this person could only see some data, hear from an external person, they might change their mind. So I think I would just caution you about the ways that you think about utilizing external evaluators. I don't want to be overly optimistic and sort of paint a sunny picture of evaluation. I know these political issues are really take a lot of care and thought, and what's feasible may really be constrained within your context. But as much as you can try to be realistic and use the process to get buy-in, I think you'll be happier with the results.
Yeah. And maybe having maybe the teachers kind of saying, yeah, that's a good idea, we should do that, rather than having more of a top-down kind of process. Definitely. Yeah. All right. Well, I do not see. Some people are interested in the book, but I think we put the link in the chat already, and you probably have it linked, right, in your handout somewhere.
The book that I mentioned is
Yeah,
in our handout. You can
yeah,
find that reference. Yep.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. We have 3 minutes to spare. You can see the many things that are coming your way in the chat as people are leaving, maybe to go teach or do something else. But yeah, it was great. Thank you so much. It was a good refresher for me also to kind of, oh yeah, right, so Yeah. Do you see more language program evaluation happening? You mentioned, the fact that it's oftentimes not published. But do you get a sense that more and more programs are engaging in this kind of work, or you don't really know?
It's hard to say. We just finished an annotated bibliography on our website, updating that of evaluation work. So that's a great resource if you're interested in published work on evaluation. We, I think, see an increased interest in outcomes and evaluation for advocacy purposes, just given
Yes.
the current state of enrollments and programs that are in some cases under threat in the US. And so I'm not sure how many people are executing those, but definitely see people wanting to do evaluation for those purposes.
Right, and giving themselves direction. I think it kind of ties into the example you gave from the University of Arizona and the Portuguese program, right? How do we grow that program? How do we make sure that not only we recruit but retain students and meet their expectations, right? As well as the goal of the program. So yeah, I can see that. All right. Well, I think since there are no more questions, I want to really thank you for this really wonderful presentations. Even though you said, we could get into the weeds more, but I think it really gave people, a nice idea of what, is possible and what things to start thinking about. And maybe once they have a better idea of where to go, what to do next, using the resources that you highlighted throughout your presentation. So I want to thank you for this really exciting, insightful presentation on language program administration.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.